Okay, then welcome. Welcome to this virtual book launch, The Empire as a Refuge, Refugees from Nazi-Occupied Europe in British Overseas Territories, the virtual book launch of the Yearbook of the Research Center for German and Austrian Exile Studies, volume number 20, under the same name. I would start with special thanks to the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the University of London to make this possible, to make this virtual book launch and event possible. My name is Swen Steinberg. I'm one of the co-editors of this volume, and I will be the moderator of this online session. And that means I have to announce a little bit about the housekeeping. So this event is entirely recorded. And questions put by members of the audience and the responses of the speakers are included in this. So anyone not wishing to be recorded should put questions by using the chat function, but I would anyway recommend to you to use the chat function for questions you might have to the presenters in our Q&A session at the end of this event, because this simply saves time. And we start with 4 short presentations, starting with Anthony Grenville and myself. And we also invited 2 contributors of our volume, Jutta Vinzent and Patrick Farges, to join us and give us a little bit more insight into their research and perspectives on the topic of this yearbook issue, Refugees from Nazi-Occupied Europe in British Overseas Territories. And we start with Anthony Grenville, with Tony. He's the chair of the Research Center for German and Austrian Exile Studies at the University of London, and he has published widely on the culture and history of Jewish refugees from Nazism in Britain, including encounters with Albion, Britain, and the British in Texts by Jewish Refugees from Nazism, published in 2018. So, Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sven. This volume is consists of the published versions of the papers held at the conference of the same name, which was held at the Institute of Modern Languages Research in Senate House, University of London, in September 2017. And I'd like to add my thanks to Sven's, particularly to Jane Lewin of the Institute, and especially to our co-organizer, Dr. Jana Borasova, whose contribution we greatly valued. The subject was this subject we chose for the 8th triennial conference of the Research Center. That means, by my mathematics, that the Research Center had then been going for long enough to hold 8 3-year spaced out conferences, which is quite an achievement for a small research center with no financial resources. Everybody's contribution is voluntary, and we have kept going now for, a quarter of a century, with a committee that's grown from the original 5 to 12. Our little research center actually held the first conference that covered the whole of this topic, that is the question of forced emigration from the Nazi-occupied continent of Europe to the whole of the British Empire or British overseas territories. Obviously, with the advent of post-colonial studies and the growing interest in colonialism, this was a subject that was really waiting to be investigated, and we actually got there first. We narrowly beat the great might of all the German historical institutes who held a conference on the same subject a little later. Now, this is, I thought, a particularly interesting subject. For me, one of the things that I discovered was the key role of Great Britain, as it were the bridgehead between Europe and Nazi-controlled Europe and the rest of the British Empire as it then was. I was aware of this vaguely in the post-war period when the Association of Jewish Refugees, founded in 1941 in London, became the key organization through which assistance and communications were channeled from the refugee communities post-war in the United States, Palestine, Latin America, to the desperate Jews who'd survived in the continent of Europe. I hadn't thought about it so much before the war, but it is in a way equally true then. And not only in the sense that the British territories overseas were to some extent guided by imperial policy. This is obviously true in the case of countries that followed the British example, British government's example, and interned refugees as enemy aliens. Kenya, of which we'll hear a bit more from Jutta later, Singapore, New Zealand, for example. Australia and Canada, in a way, in a more drastic form, because they accepted refugees who'd been interned in Britain and were deported largely against their will to those territories. I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to spend a couple of minutes trying to investigate very briefly the personal level. And here I refer to this little document, or well, book. It's actually the address book. It's called a memo book. It's the address book of my aunt's, that's my father's elder sister, my aunt Edith's first husband, Otto Gross, a refugee like my parents from Vienna, and like my aunt. I don't call him my uncle because he died in London before I was born. He died during the war of natural causes. And when I looked at his address book, I was fascinated by what I found there. I'll give you just a brief taster of it because I haven't much time. Looking at letter G, I found an Emil Gelles, Outram Hotel, Outram Road, district of Fort in Bombay, first address. Then Palm Court, Churchgate Reclamation, likewise in Fort, Bombay. Robert Glazinger, Grace Building 77, York Street, Sydney, New South Wales. Dr. A. Gross, Allenby Street 109, Tel Aviv. A Dr. Grunberg, first address Genoa in Italy, then Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. Some of the people I recognized, my father's close friend, Paul Geiger, who I thought had gone to the United States directly, it appears with a London telephone number, WES. People of my age will remember before the numbers became only numeral, that this was Western, part of Western London. I remember my mother's friend, Gertie Steiner, became Gilbert. She went to Canada. I didn't know that she'd been at a girls' school in Penarth in Glamorgan, Wales. Whether as a student or a teacher, I don't know. Someone I knew very well was my father's cousin, Hans Stolper. I knew that he'd been a successful engineer in India, and sure enough, there he is, Ingenieur Hans Stolper, P.O. Box 45 Madras, then Connemara Hotel Madras, then care of Folkart Brothers Engineering, Bombay. Addresses likewise for people under the letter S in Johannesburg, and a W. Stuttgart, 909 Avenue Joffre, Shanghai. This, just to give you some idea of the, just in this little address book, and I've really only chosen 2 letters, of the way in which people spread across the former imperial territories. Many of them originating in this country, like Gilbert Steiner, for example, or Paul Geiger. And I found this really a fascinating thing. I'm going to end on a different note because I'm going to go back to letter G, and I also found there the names of my father's parents, my paternal grandparents, Bernhard and Flora Grünfeld. The Grünfeld was our family name before my father changed it to Grenville when he took British nationality after the war. And Bernhard and Flora Grünfeld's address, I'm sorry to say, was 33/2a Sulzfelder Straße, Lodz, Litzmannstadt. And that, of course, shows you the background to this forced emigration. And that was an address from which nobody returned. That concludes my remarks. I'm now going to put on my other hat and introduce my next speaker, who is my co-host and co-editor of the volume and colleague, and I may say good friend, Swen Steinberg, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Sven took his doctorate at his native university, the Technische Universität Dresden, where he was also a postdoctoral researcher. And after a stint as a postdoctoral research fellow at with the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft at University of UCLA in Los Angeles, he took his present job in Kingston, Ontario. Sven has already made an impact on exile studies in North America. He's an affiliate scholar at the German Historical Institute in Washington, DC. And I think I'm correct in calling it a research ambassador for the German Academic Exchange Service at Queen's University. He's published, for what seems to be a very young man, a large amount, 3 monographs and numerous articles, as well as organizing conferences, hours, and also a lot of co-editing, including, I see, an issue of the very prestigious German journal, Geschichte und Gesellschaft. Anyway, over to you, Sven.
Thanks so much, Tony. Too much honor and too much hats I already bear. I would just give you a brief introduction into our introduction and into the volume. So the title of the introduction to this volume on refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe in British overseas territories is entitled Forgotten Destinations ? And this is what I try to focus on within the next 3 or 4 minutes, just to give you a brief introduction to the research and the field. So in recent years, research on refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe has not only focused on the global Northwest and known destinations such as the United States, Great Britain, Palestine, or Scandinavia. Instead, research has become more and more concerned with the peripheries of the global South, extends beyond the year 1945, and is focused on aspects such as transit or further migration to regions or countries of refuge where the caesura of 1945 had less meaning, and where questions of final settlement or further departure were part of the everyday reality of identity formation, sometimes until the 1950s and 1960s and across generations. The 12 contributions to this volume range across the full global extent of British dominions and colonies, as well as other territories that were under British control at the time of the forced migration of the Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe. So our volume collected contributions about Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Palestine, Singapore, Kenya, Australia, Shanghai, and India. But this geographical approach is not the connecting element or link of the volume. Rather, the contributions deal with questions of agency, identity, longing and belonging, and not least the temporalities of departure and arrival. Escape from Nazi-occupied Europe took place as a transnational transmigration and mostly occurred in several stages, beginning with the decision to flee, the location of reachable destinations, and the frequently complicated organization of paperwork and money. Many of the refugees fled country by country, at first within Europe, where often stopped in flight at some point or reached a safe destination more or less accidentally, given the rapidly changing situation that confronted them, especially since 1938. However, the destinations, not only, but mostly in British overseas territories, were not final. Many Jewish refugees searched for ways to reach Palestine or the US after 1945, and others moved on later because of the dawning of the era of decolonization, for example, in India or South Africa. So are the places of refuge in British overseas territories forgotten destinations? The contributions in this volume show that these places of refuge, shelter, negotiation, solidarity, translation, transit, and encounters have increasingly attracted research interest, especially in recent years, and at the same time within families, but also in the context of current movements of refugees and migrants. Above all, the volume shows that this perspective on flight and exile to the forgotten destinations in the global south is already a promising field of research for the future, and hopefully this volume is a contribution to this field. I will finish with a short remark or a short description of something that surprised me when I wrote this introduction, or first prepared, of course, together with Tony, this conference, and then prepared this this volume and the introduction. And what surprised me the most when it comes to this question, are these destinations really forgotten, is the representation of these destinations in popular culture. This was the at least most surprising fact for me, because I didn't know that before. So the literary portrayal in novels, for example, or short stories, in which the British dominions, colonies, and overseas territories are presented fictionally, biographically, or autobiographically, are somehow known. The best known one is probably the 1995 novel Nowhere in Africa by Stephanie Zweig, portraying her refuge in the British colony of Kenya, and we will hear about Kenya from Jutta in a minute. But there are a lot of other autobiographically and biographically based publications that describe the deportation to and internment, for example, in Australia, or the escape to New Zealand. This also applies, also a surprise to me, to the portrayal of this exile in movies and TV miniseries depicting the colonial British sphere of influence. They all appeared within the last 10 or 15 years. And the most surprising example to me is undoubtedly the Chinese animated film A Jewish Girl in Shanghai, of 18 minutes in length and produced in 2010, and especially for a younger or family audience. So this kind of shows that the representation of this topic and the not forgotten destinations, obviously, and the focus, especially in popular culture, again, to me, pretty much surprising fact. Our first presenter from the volume is Jutta Vinzent, and she will follow me now. She is a senior lecturer for modern and contemporary art and visual culture at University of Birmingham. She has published widely on aesthetic concepts of space and the visual cultures of exile and migration, including most recently Spatio-Temporalities on the Line, edited with Sebastian Dorsch in 2017. Again, Jutta contributed a wonderful article about the British internment of refugees from Nazi Germany in Kenya during World War II. And this is also what she will speak about now. So Jutta, floor is yours. I think you have to.
Thank you very much, Sven, for this lovely introduction and also for inviting me to take part in this launch by looking what I thought of the specific role of exile studies in studies of the British Empire. Stories and histories are entangled. This can be said for migration as well as the study of migration. And Tony's address book is a contribution to actually how entangled actually migration has been. But it's also the study of migration. Let me illustrate this by beginning with a story as to how I came to researching internment in colonial Kenya. It must have been at a conference convened by the Research Center for German and Austrian Exile Studies, precisely the center that has edited the book that we are launching today. At this conference in about 2011, I met Lavinia Davenport, who told me about her Jewish father being interned in Kenya over coffee. She added that her father, who was an artist and gallerist, moved to Malta after the independence of Kenya and from there to the UK, where he died in his 70s in 1998. I was intrigued, as I have been interested in post-colonial studies, teaching at the University of Birmingham a module on the topic that covered contemporary art and migration, and having also published on the advantages of exile studies for post-colonial theory, and vice versa, in a book entitled Identity and Image in 2006, a book which deals with artists in Britain, and in Britain, not in the British Empire at the time. It was, however, not until 2016 when the call for a conference on the emigration to, and I quote, areas under British control was published, when I tried to get in contact with Lavinia again. Of course, after several years, her email could have changed, anything could have happened. Nevertheless, I tried, but unfortunately, I did not get an answer. Hence, I searched the net for any relations to her, writing emails to those that may know Lavinia, such as peers at her grammar school in Malta, which runs an alumni group. And before long, Lavinia and I exchanged details about her father's migration route. This shows not only how entangled our globalized world is, but also how the internet provides us with much information on migration. So it seems that the resources for the field of exile studies is rather growing than diminishing. There is still much to say and discover about German and Austrian refugees of the 1930s, and I would also include, obviously, those from Czechoslovakia and those who were refugees to National Socialism. However, not all histories are told as entangled. What struck me most profoundly while undertaking my studies in Kenya were two issues. On the one hand, the National Museum in Nairobi illustrated the history of Kenya through photographs and everyday life objects, stressing the British power and its colonial past as a black and white history between colonizer and colonized, which ended in the liberation and independence of Kenya. There was no mention of European refugees or prisoners of war. This part of the national history was silenced. Indeed, the National Museum is an institution that seemingly celebrates the black and condemns the British. It has therefore been with surprise that the National Archive in Nairobi is still organized in the manner of the National Archives at Kew Gardens. Similar folders and similar ways of identifying the folders, namely the structure of the reference code, demonstrate that the history of Kenya is one that is ordered and systemized until today in the same manner as the British have undertaken at Kew Gardens. If one sees with Foucault the archive as the cultural heritage of a people, the British still seem to rule actually Kenya. Therefore, one wonders about how entangled histories are. Is there not a clear demarcation between colonizer and colonized, between those in power and those that were subjected to that power? To which extent is the upholding of a binary a political tool, and to which extent a historical reality? The British Empire has become the focus of post-colonialism, which is dedicated to the study of cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism. Since its beginnings, with publications such as Said's Orientalism that appeared in 1978, post-colonial studies has moved on. Said's book, known for describing binary social relations in which the so-called West created the East to allow suppression of the other, triggered a number of studies, such as those on hybridity and what is currently on vogue, at least in the UK, decolonizing practices. Driven by social justice, curricula in art history, for example, draw attention to the inclusion of minorities and marginalized groups, and therefore attempt to decolonize a field dominated by white Western male artists. My question is, what role exile studies could play in light of post-colonial studies and the study of the empire that brought refuge to many emigres from National Socialism? As illustrated in my article, two results have come out by studying refugees in colonies. Namely, refugees brought a complexity to an understanding of British colonialism as a relationship between metropole and colony. While colonial studies have assumed that London reigned and the colonies followed, the correspondence between the colonial office and the colonies on the one side and the records on the internment held at Nairobi on the other demonstrate that a number of issues were dealt with only in Kenya, including the organization of sentry duties and managerial issues. Secondly, the study of refugees also exposed strategies of British colonial power, such as the employment of Black Africans for internment sentry duties and the privileged treatment of refugees compared to those of prisoners of war. While much has been published on all kinds of exile countries, what has been neglected so far is the role of German and Austrian emigres in the colonial process, both in the French as well as British Empire. In numbers, the British Empire was larger than the French one, with roughly 23% of the world population and 24% of the Earth's total land in the first half of the 20th century. Therefore, this topic is particularly significant in terms of the British Empire as refuge and the volume which we are celebrating with the launch today, Refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe in British overseas territories, is a contribution to the study of exile beyond Britain. I would argue that one of the roles of refugees from Nazism in the British Empire is that of a mediator between colonizer and colonized. Indeed, emigres cannot only be discussed in a context of insider-outsider, but as mediator between colonized and colonizer, between hegemonic power and the so-called indigenous. As shown in my article, refugees belonged to the white European class, but were also not fully belonging to the British, particularly not during World War II, when the UK was at war with Germany and emigres became enemy aliens, being interned in the entire British Empire. A further example related to emigration to Kenya will illustrate the mediating role of the refugee. I found it most intriguingly that Jewish landowners employed refugees as so-called farm managers to look after their land. This meant that they spoke Swahili with the workers on the farms and lived on the farm, while landowners had only a few visits to actually their farm, residing in the main towns of Nairobi and Mombasa. And to end with a reference to my beginning, with more resources becoming available online and the possibility to get in touch globally, I believe that the study of German and Austrian refugees has a particular role to play in the understanding of processes of decolonization and in post-colonial studies, namely to demonstrate and illustrate the complexity of life in British Empire, in the British Empire, as well as British overseas territories, an understanding that is far off from a simplified understanding of a binary between colonized and colonizer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jutta, for this short insight to your research and your perspectives. And we start over with Patrick Farges. He's a professor of German and gender history at the Department of Languages and Intercultural Studies at the University of Paris, Diderot, and he has published extensively on the culture and history of refugees from Nazism in Canada and in Mandate Palestine, including the Bindestrich-Identitäten volume about Sudeten German Social Democrats and German Jews in exile in Canada. He contributed a wonderful paper entitled Transnational Jäckigkeit from a Canadian Perspective, and being here in Kingston, Ontario, I'm pretty much looking forward to your Canadian perspective right now. So thanks for joining us, Patrick. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this very, very kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity given to me to have this virtual roundtable, which is kind of a new exercise we have to get used to in the next months and years, I don't know. First of all, I would like to say that the conference in London was a tremendous enrichment to me, and I think this comes out of what Tony said as well earlier on. And I was thrilled to read the book that came out of the conference, also because it was a way of recalling the world before, not so long ago, when we had actual seminars, conferences, and actual debates in presentia. Reading the book, I was struck by the number of shared elements in the various contributions, and I have tried to systematize my reading impressions, and I would like to highlight actually 3 aspects. Let me come to the first point. First, I would like to emphasize that the book contributes, I believe, to rethinking the new geographies of exile, as you said, Sven. It helps to redefine our concepts of centrality versus periphery, and this is what Jutta was just alluding to, centrality versus periphery in exile studies. Only fairly recently did exile studies get interested in those refugees going east and going south, to quote from Margit Franz and Heimo Halbreiner's book. But I think it's not just about going east and south, it's about going east, south, and back and forth. And here I'd like to stress how indebted I feel towards the transnational turn of the 90s, because instead of focusing solely on rupture, the transnational has helped us focus on longue durée continuities and on those ties that migrant families forged between host societies, this in-betweenness. Those are ways of belonging that include a variety of practices of staying connected across time and space. The transnational thus helps us rethink social fabrics in the process of being made. And we need, as is the case in this book, to continue focusing on the complex, entangled, and connected histories of exile. Jutta has alluded to it, but the wonderful chapter of Jyoti Sabharwal in the book also speaks of entangled and connected histories. Let me come to the second point. I think that the transnational space created by the forced migration of the 30s might be best described as a diaspora in the diaspora, in which entangled identities such as Germanness or Austrianness for that matter, Jewishness, but also German Jewishness, had to be constantly renegotiated. I am struck by the ways in which individuals and families shaped and navigated their local lives in transnational cultures and how they constantly redefined their own sense of where the center versus where the periphery was located for them, which is, of course, a central problem in the definition of a diaspora. Where is the center? The forced exile of from Nazi Europe, out of Nazi Europe, is an example of a divergent migration, which makes it possible to trace transnational life trajectories and networks from one place, that place being, let's say, Central Europe, to a variety of destinations. The German Jewish sense of identity after migration was largely situational. It depended on the exile's relations with other communities in those multicultural societies they migrated to. If we think, for instance, of Canada, if we think of Palestine, or if we think of Shanghai as being multicultural societies back in the 30s and 40s. And yet, transnational ties also existed and persisted within multiple three-way spaces linking Montreal, Toronto, or Sydney to London, New York, Jerusalem, and also to the original, quote unquote, places in Central Europe, Berlin, Frankfurt, Vienna, or Prague. German Jewish families maintained transnational, or maybe I should say translocal, ties between Jerusalem and Toronto, between Tel Aviv and New York, and of course, your address book was a wonderful example. It's a wonderful source as well, I think, for historians. They visited family members and friends wherever, whenever possible. They wrote letters, they sent packages, and above all, they knew about what was going on in their relatives' lives abroad. The exiles relied on chain solidarities. This is a concept used by Monica Tempian in her chapter in the book. They relied on kinship relations, they relied on close-knit communities and on various self-help organizations that provided assistance. My own research on Canada shows that, in a supranational manner, the Yekkes sometimes felt closer to other German Jews abroad than to their Jewish co-religionists within Canada's borders. And yet, this diaspora in the diaspora was not free from internal contradictions. German Jews and Austrian Jews of the first generation did not mingle, not necessarily, nor did convinced Zionists and non-Zionists. Bourgeois families looked down on those with an Ost-Jüdish past. Those who left in the 30s were distinct from the Holocaust survivors after the war, etc., etc. However, as Atina Grossman, who attended the conference in London 3 years ago, as Atina once wrote, I quote, "The history of German Jews continued outside of Germany in Washington Heights, in the Upper West Side, Golders Green and Hampstead, Tel Aviv, Moshav Germanid, and Rehavia, certain neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, and elsewhere. In some ways, they were all the same China, the same doilies, the same accents." Let me come to one further point concerning this diaspora and the diaspora. As there was no single loyalty, this is a quote from Sarah Schwab in her chapter about South Africa, how do we deal with the specific archival situation we are facing? As migration historians, we are faced with fragmented and dispersed sources in several languages, with a form of diaspora of the archives. How do we find those virtual family networks of letters? Again, a quote from Sarah Schwab. How can we capture the multiple dynamics of this diaspora in the diaspora and write a history of movement, of connections, of networks, but also a history of fragmentation and of absence? And I think what you said, Tony, about this address book being at the same time a source for transnational history, but also a source of the addresses of those who have not survived the Holocaust. I mean, this entangledness of surviving and not surviving the Holocaust is still something very difficult to write about. And of course, I have no definitive answer to those questions. Let me now briefly come to the third and final point. In remapping the center versus the peripheries of exile, I am struck when reading this book by the imperial aspects of the British policy, as Tony said earlier. Decisions made in London had very concrete and life-changing consequences for refugees in British overseas territories, in the Dominions, in Canada, and in various colonial settings. For instance, several chapters, most chapters actually, evoke the various forms of wartime internment of so-called enemy aliens. This British imperial technology of interning dangerous aliens affected many lives in multiple ways. The war internment and subsequent deportation on behalf of Britain of a motley crew of men, among them German and Austrian Jewish refugees, is indeed an astonishing episode of the Second World War. But if we think about it, this was actually a longue durée, trans-imperial technology of dealing with undesirable men, or dangerous men. This story is part of a British imperial history. It is a white European affair. This is this is a quote from your chapter, Jutta, a white European affair. For example, one category was regularly mobilized in the internment camps, that of the able-bodied man. This is a gendered category, which Jutta Vinzent has in one of her quotes too, like in my sources, which is really interesting, this category of the able-bodied man. An able-bodied man was a man in good physical shape, capable of working for the empire. This is a transnational, I would say, or transimperial category, as it was widely shared in all parts of the British Empire. It was aimed at branding socially inferior or ethnically stigmatized masculinities, and it is a persistent category throughout the 20th century. In this transimperial logic, Britain, its dominions and colonial overseas territories were places where undesirable men, in our case, Jewish refugees from Central Europe, were to be put to productive work in the service of the British Empire. And this included in various parts of the world, joining, for instance, the British war effort in combatant or non-combatant units. But I will stop here, and I hope that we can have a virtual dispersed discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Patrick. I think both contributions highlighted a lot of aspects that might be of interest to deepen them in the discussion. We can start right now. We have about 30 minutes left. So also thanks for your discipline when it comes to the time. But we have plenty of time for questions and answers for a Q&A session. Before I open this Q&A session, just I wanted to mention one member in the audience. I saw Veronika Zwerger joined us from Vienna, and she's also in our volume with a contribution about Australia. So there is another specialist in the audience from this volume. So as I've already mentioned at the beginning, we can handle questions and contributions via the chat, or just signal me, raise your hand, and I can bring you into the discussion if you have any questions, or if you would like to respond to the introductions. Yeah, Jutta.
Patrick, thank you so much for your contribution, which looked at it from a complete different perspective. And I think despite not having been talking about what we present, it really works very well. And I would underpin anything you have said. One thing I was wondering, nevertheless, where I feel I distinguish, or my research has shown me a different line of results, so to speak, than what you say. I mean, you emphasized very much how dependent regulations put out in London had an impact actually on colonies. And I do agree. But when you think about how colonial history has been done for many centuries, for many decades before actually post-colonialism, I would say that, and also having studied, that was my experience, actually traveling to Kenya and actually looking at the archives, where I did find copies of correspondence that are also at Kew Gardens, in the National Archives. But I did find also much information about things that were not regulated by London. And also this might now be, I tried to find the resource again, but I didn't have enough time. But I found this one letter coming back from Ceylon. I think you say Ceylon, Sri Lanka nowadays, coming back and saying, look, I'm really sorry, but we don't have that many refugees. Could we not house them together in the internment and don't separate males and females? And I need, because I've talked about that before. And actually what happened is the Colonial Office in London wrote back saying that, yes, please have a family camp. And actually, as you do know, at the Isle of Man, there was also one where men and women were actually held then together. So this is one story which underpins and also other kind of material that I found where they discussed, for example, what I say, managerial issues and so on. When you then go into the colonies, which you can nowadays, not in the time of Corona, yeah, but when you then have a look, yeah, you actually are able to read the story from the other side. And what I find is that also, to some extent, obviously, the British Empire was reigned by London. I would still say the potential that is there to study it not as a metropole and periphery, but rather as a network, as somehow comes through what you're saying. Yeah, I wonder whether this is not a methodologically more sensible approach, probably, because I do believe, and what I say, I need to find my seal on example, and probably need to publish on that, because that is quite speaking, that actually the empire wrote back. Yeah, but yeah, so therefore, in a way, this is where I find also speaking about whether this, and that's probably more a suggestion, whether kind of network, looking into that topic in terms of networks, brings you away from this centrality and marginality. That is a kind of Foucaultian idea from probably also from the 1980s. And I do think it has also real impact, political impact, on how you view migrants. And I talk about migrants also in terms of today, because it is about marginalized groups. And if you do not only talk about center and periphery, you do not marginalize them immediately from the start, but you are looking at the connections that happen between. And I think this is a change of power, where you provide, or where you give the power into the relationship, rather than already starting from the beginning to say someone is in power and someone is not in power, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for this. Thank you for this remark. It's actually very, very, very true. And what you're saying, first of all, you're saying that the empire strikes back, which is true. And the other thing is, we should indeed think more in terms of what empires are in the longue durée again. Because if we look at I'm not a specialist of the Ottoman Empire, obviously, but we have just organized in Paris a conference about trans-imperial connections between different periods, including the Ottoman Empire, etc. And the way empires work is exactly what you're saying. Actually, it's less about centrality and periphery than about networks, than about trans-imperial connections, and it is very true. If I'm taking my example, my Canadian example, and the way in which Canada had to actually deal with internees that had been interned in Great Britain and deported to Canada, it was kind of a British history on Canadian soil. And yet the Canadians, they used and mobilized their own technology of internment that had a different history. They had their own rules, their own regulations, their own representations of what undesirable or dangerous aliens or men were. In a way, Canada was an empire too. It was it had an internal imperial logic, especially in the 30s, when it was after the Statutes of Westminster in 1931, getting away from this influence, from the British influence. So yeah, it is very, very true. Thank you.
May I?
Yeah.
Question. This is really to Patrick, and also if I can drag her into the discussion, Veronica Zwerger. I'm very interested in the difference in the reactions in Canada and Australia, between Canada and Australia, to the refugees who were deported there. In Australia, you can go to Hay in New South Wales and to Tura in Victoria State, where the refugees were located, where the camps where they were held were located, and there's museums. It's part of the local history. There's a Dunera association. The Dunera, you probably all know, was the ship on which the unfortunate deportees were sent from Britain to Australia. And the Dunera Association continues to exist and publish a newsletter. But as far as I know, in Canada, the situation is completely different. If you go to Yearbook or Trois-Rivières, there is not a great, there may have been recently, but until very recently, there was very little interest in what in what had happened there during the period of internment. And I wondered why that might be, because from its sort of lofty position in London, we tend to say, oh, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, what used to be in my youth called the White Dominions. Of course, you wouldn't want to say that now. Well, I mean, they're not very white anymore in terms of their population. I wondered if it was to do with national identity. And Canada had, for a relatively new nation, nonetheless quite a long, a well-developed sense of national identity and culture. Whereas Australia, as I was always taught, the Australians and New Zealanders really only acquired a sense of identity with the catastrophe of the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, and that was only 25 years before the refugees, the Jewish refugees, arrived. I wonder if Patrick, and if she's willing to answer, Veronica had any thoughts on that matter.
Again, I'm not sure I have a definitive answer about Canada. One thing is true, is the way in which Canada had, until the 70s, I would say, had difficulties in dealing with its internal multicultural society. The first bilingual society, French and Anglophone, being the first one, and maybe Swen, who's living there, might say something too. But until the 70s, this was a problematic issue. So of course, all the rest, all other issues would be different. But as to the ways in which the memorial cultures are different, the memory cultures are different in Canada and Australia, I wouldn't know. I know that the historical debate about the Holocaust, about Canada's indifference in the 30s, and its indirect role in the Holocaust. This tremendous impact this book had by Irving Abella and Harold Troper, None is Too Many, in the 80s. Probably made it impossible to memorialize what happened to the refugees, to those people who actually were able to get into Canada, be it by deportation from Great Britain. So probably this plays a role, this very intense debate on the history of the Holocaust as of the 80s. As 83 is the first public publication of this book. And the memorial, the former refugees have had forms of memorialization of a club as well. Helmut Kahlmann played a tremendous role, who was an archivist, a music archivist. He played a tremendous role in keeping this network together. Erich Koch as well, the journalist, and who wrote this book in the 80s. But it's true that there was no public, until recently, acknowledgement of what had happened. That's true. Maybe Veronica or Sven.
Veronica, do you want to say something? But I mean, I can add some just briefly from the Canadian perspective. So this deportation and internment story is rather short in the Second World War. And when you go to Pier 21, the Museum of Canadian Immigration in Halifax, the story is there, but it's subsumized into a huge immigration story. So this is only a part of it, and I think this both contributes to an answer why this hardly plays a role. The locations of internment here in Canada, they are only temporarily, so they existed for months, probably sometimes for 1 or 2 years, not even longer, and this means they are locally remembered. Sometimes you have also nowadays local initiatives to remember these places, but they were really short-living. So they were just there, set up on a temporarily basis, and then they simply disappeared together with the people that were inside. And this is probably also part of the answer why this hardly played a role. And again, on the other hand, they are much more included into a bigger immigration story of a story of people that were coming to Canada, and in this case on a forced basis. One last observation in the context of this of the refugee movements in the last years, Canada's role in history when it comes to accepting refugees, being open to refugees, was a topic discussed in the public again. And coming back to Pier 21 and to Halifax, there is this small monument made by Daniel Libeskind, the Wheel of Conscience. This is widely known, and this memorial tells the story of rejection. So this is how this kind of role Canada played is remembered. So not so much the inclusion or all those terms that were used for it. It's more the opposite. That, for example, the St. Louis had no safe harbor in Canada as well.
Thank you.
Are there any more
in the colonies, such as, for example, in Kenya, also, I can only say that it's absolutely right. They were just, I mean, for the UK, it's also true that these internment camps were only temporary and then used either also for prisoners of war in terms of in Kenya, especially in Kabete, and nowadays it's actually a place for juveniles. So I had difficulties actually to get in, and it's also difficult to find also documentation. When I then knew that it was a juvenile place for juveniles, as it was also before, then I could also find much more documentation in the archives. So this kind of changing, use of buildings, I think this is also part of internment, where this is just only for short period, something like that. Or in Kenya, or also in other colonies, they were actually also, refugees were actually interned twice. They were interned at the beginning of the Second World War, and they only were in prisons, in local prisons. So there isn't any, you can't remember that in a way at all, you know, and that was only for a short period, 4 to 6 weeks, and then they were released. Yeah. So only later, when they were for about a year or so, that was when they were put into places that were somehow not occupied. That was the problem.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Sarah Halpon. I think you have to unmute you. Yeah, there you are.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to keep my camera up, but it's just, thank you so much for this incredibly fascinating discussion. You brought up a lot of topics that I just hadn't really thought about. I'm saying that because I'm actually finishing up my doctoral thesis on Jewish refugees in Shanghai after World War II. But one of the things I've been wanting to ask, but I've been asking myself, is one of the things that was really interesting to me in the way to which I was watching were observing the emigration of the Jewish refugees from Shanghai to different places. Well, mainly I've been concentrating on United States, Australia, and Canada. And one of the really interesting thing was noticing how there seem to be so many more. I mean, actually have the numbers that there were a lot more Austrian Jews going to Australia. And of course, all of you know that Australian immigration at the time, you can go if only you had a close relative. So I was really struck that the Austrian Jews were having just as much of a good chance of going to Australia and German Jews as opposed to going to the United States. So one of the numbers is saying going forward is tracking, just answer the question of why so many Austrian Jews end up in Australia. I don't know about Austrian Jews flight from Austria in 1938, 39. But I'm just wondering in your own various case studies that you put together for the British Empire, did you notice any particular demographics balance between German and Austrian Jews?
Mm-hmm. This is probably an answer for you, Patrick. A question for you, because the Austrian Jews played a role in Canada as well.
It's actually more more of a topic in the other project which the Canadian study was my PhD research. The newer project was my habilitation, because in France we still have this wonderful thing called habilitation. And it was on Mandate Palestine, and there there is actually a high percentage of Austrian Jews who went to Mandate Palestine in the 30s. But this has to do, in my case, so of course it's just an answer. First of all, it's an emigration of the 30s. So it's before the war, the one I looked into. And it has to do with the degree of affiliation to Zionist organizations in the homeland. And it happens that the Austrian Jews who finally migrated to Mandate Palestine were part of the Zionist networks in Austria, which made it, of course, possible to emigrate to Palestine, which is why there is such a high number of among the German-speaking Jews in Israel of Austrians, but also of Czechoslovaks who were German-speaking for some of them, or Polish Jews. But I have no clue as to what you're saying. So basically, why after 1945, it probably has to do with who you knew, chain migration, what were the local assistance, the local aid associations. It probably has to do with that. I don't know.
Jutta? Or Tony first, yeah.
Sorry if I'm butting in front of someone else. It just as far as I know, as far as I think, this comes down again to emigration first to the United Kingdom. Now, when I started researching the Jews from Vienna, where my family came from, which was where a good 90% of Austrian Jews came from, I was astonished to find the figures collated by the Jewish representative organization, the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, first of all for the Gestapo towards the end of the war, and then just after the war for the Allied occupying powers. Of the 180,000 approximately Jews in Vienna, 120,000 were able to escape. And of those, just over 30,000 came to the United Kingdom as first country of refuge. That's slightly more than went to the United States. The number in the United States became greater because of subsequent transmigration. And as a result, the concentration of Austrian, i.e. Viennese Jews in London in particular, in Northwest London, was quite great. And I would imagine that quite a number of those went on to Australia. They were certainly very well represented amongst the men on the deportees on the Dunera. That may have to do with it.
Mm.
Sorry, I didn't want to.
And Jutta, you raised your hand as well.
I have a question back to Sarah, because I have been working about an artist who also gave a paper on in Perth, and this was a German artist. And by the way, I found this fascinating, a female artist who gave birth in Cologne while migrating, so to speak, first to Britain to catch a boat, to go then to Perth and stay there. And now her family is there as well. And the local museum organized an exhibition, which is the South Wales museum, which belongs to the university there. So Sarah, can one make a difference between, this is my question, between the south, the west and the east coast of Australia in terms of Austrian refugees? Have you found anything? Because what I say, I mean, the refugee I know, and usually this is part of, like Patrick has said, of a group knowing others and so on. Germans went to Perth, so they went to the west coast. So I was wondering whether you can whether you know of a difference in Australia or anybody else.
Thank you for the question. And thank you everyone for your speculation. I had not thought about Austrian Jews going through Great Britain. But to your question, actually I really don't know about Perth per se, but what I do know is most of the Australian Jews, most of the Jews who came to Australia primarily settled in Sydney and Melbourne, but the refugees from Nazi Europe mostly settled in Melbourne because it was more recent migrants from the 1920s, so it was more welcoming in that sense. Because the Sindhi Jews were very assimilated, Anglo-Jews. So I'm not really sure about Perth, but what's interesting is that in terms of migration after 1945, all the ships and planes that came from Shanghai went straight to the East Coast, where the ship coming from Europe end up in Perth. Everybody got off at Perth and fanned out from there. But I think that's a really great question that could be explored much further. Thank you.
Yeah, and also thanks from my side. This is what I try to highlight in my brief introduction today. I think this is what our volume shows as well, that this story isn't simply over because the Second World War ended. So this further and onward migration was there were a couple of reasons for decision-making of onward migration, and it was not just going back to Austria. There was also this humongous problem of stateless persons, that people didn't have simply passports and valid documents. And as far as I know, the research about Asia after the Second World War, this is also a problem of transportation at that time. So it wasn't so much easy to get on a boat and get away from Shanghai. Like we imagine that, okay, the war's over and people could go anywhere. There were hardly any ships because everything was destroyed because of the Second World War. So this is a complex story as well, also related to identity and belonging, and the question many people had to answer for themselves: where's home and where to go there. So we have about 2 minutes left in our event. So if there is another, and there is Patrick. Patrick raises his hand. Yeah. Go ahead.
Because I don't want to leave this virtual room without saying that one thing in Jutta's presentation was really struck me, and I wrote it down. This is why this function of mediators, as you said, Jutta, the German Jewish refugees in Kenya played the role of mediators, and they did in various societies during the war and after the war, because after the war, of course, the social fabric in various host societies changed dramatically, and given this migration background, given this background of forced migration, of internment, of several migrations sometimes, given the fact that all families had been affected by the Holocaust in some way or the other, they were mediators, and there is actually for Israel, for the young state of Israel, this attempt of German Jews to create a party who would stay for Verständigung between Jews and Arabs. So this is really, and this is Anja Siegemund's work, it's not mine. So I think there is tremendous potential for further studies of the exile as mediator, the refugee as Mittler, die Mittlerfunktion, I think.
Many thanks. That's exactly what I wanted to present. Thank you.
So I underlined the same in my notes. So this the role of mediators between colonized and colonizers. I would say so too. And the first thing I thought about was, okay, this might be also a question of sources. You Patrick, you mentioned the absence in the sources and the absence of this kind of story. I mean, this is what we face here as well, right? I already mentioned we entitled the introduction "Forgotten Destinations," and probably this is also part of the answer to this question. So, what kind of sources can we work with, or where do we exactly discover this kind of mediating roles? As you described it very nice, Jutta, in your talk. Okay, I think we are good with the time, so I would like to thank all of you. First, of course, Jutta and Patrick for joining us with your brief, short papers, and to Tony as well, of course. I would like to thank especially Jane Levine and the Institute of Modern Languages Research at University of London for making this event possible, and organizing this virtual book launch. Hopefully you are now pretty much interested to have a look into this volume, and hopefully you enjoy it. Do you want to say something more, Tony?
No, I'm thank you very much to all the participants. It's good to see you all here virtually.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.